this is an AOC 24G2, and this also is an AOC 24G2, but despite having the same name and looking identical from the outside, both are actually quite different monitors. And that's thanks to AOC using two different panels for the same monitor, and at this point in time you won't even know which version you get before buying. Yep, it's a mess. But there's a silver lining. In my initial review I already showed you how to access the factory menu to find out which version you got. And in this video we'll compare both versions side by side, and I will show you how to tell them apart from the outside even before opening the box. And I can only hope that retailers will use that information and add the respective monitor version to the listings on the website, so that we can actually decide which one of the 24G2s we want to buy or not. Needless to say that we'll go in depth on which version to choose for which use case, as each version has their own pros and cons. AOC provided the old 24G2 for the purpose of this comparison. They don't get any input on my editorial direction, nor did they try to, so everything in this video reflects my own and honest opinion. Now, in case you live on a rock or something, the AOC 24G2 is one of the most popular gaming monitors, and it's easy to see why. It's a very affordable 144Hz IPS monitor that's got fantastic reviews when it came out back in late 2019 without many alternatives on the market. Of course, those reviews refer to the original 24G2 that you may or may not get when you buy one today. I did a full review covering the new version in detail and everything about ergonomics, build quality and so on that applies to both versions. I'll leave that link down below. This is kind of a follow-up video comparing both versions side by side and giving additional information on how to tell both versions apart. Now, I previously referred to both monitors as the old and new 24G2, which sort of implies that the old version isn't on sale anymore. However, thanks to many of you guys, I've been able to gather some data suggesting that there are still a lot of old models on sale right now. November 2020 seems to have been the point in time where many new models hit the store shelves. Before November, less than 20% got the new model, whereas since November 2020 almost 40% came with the newer panel. In 2021, till the date of this video, the margins stayed about consistent, leading me to believe that both versions coexist. At least for now. Keep in mind that this data is based on a few dozen 24G2s, so take it for what it's worth. I asked AOC whether the original 24G2 still is in production, but I didn't get an answer yet. Of course, I will pin a comment down below when or if I receive any information about that. Anyhow, I will now refer to the old or original 24G2 as version 1 and call the newer version version 2 respectively. Let's just hope we don't discover a version 3 on top of that. So how do both versions compare side by side? Now, the first thing you will notice is that the first version, here on the right side, gets quite a bit brighter than the second version. We are talking about a difference of roughly 100 nits here in favor of the first version 24G2. Safe to say that's a plus, especially if you see yourself using your monitor in a bright room. Turning the brightness all the way down leaves us with about 80 nits with both versions. That's a decent value for darker rooms. Thanks to its higher overall brightness, the first version reaches 140 nits at a brightness setting of 24 to 26, which all lead to the exact same brightness by the way. The newer version needs to be set to 38 or 37 or 36 respectively. I really don't get the trend to make every 3 brightness steps do exactly the same, but this is consistent across both versions. Now, the original version was known for its exceptional contrast, that is for an IPS panel at least. So with version 1, we're getting a better black level at the same brightness and therefore a higher contrast ratio of almost 1500 to 1. Whereas the second version is setting around the 1000 to 1 mark, which is a very typical value for an IPS panel. Typical in this case surely doesn't mean bad, but the V1 has a 40% better contrast ratio, and that's certainly something. Especially if you're planning to watch a lot of videos or movies on your monitor, that's something you want. Also, things like photo or video editing can benefit from higher contrast ratio. It's nice to know whether the dark parts of your image are actually black or a dark gray. The overall deeper black level also helps masking some dark level ununiformity issues. Switching to the second version 24G2, we can see a few more bright spots, especially at the top of the screen. The exaggerated photo makes this much clearer. Well, sometimes you win and sometimes you lose the panel lottery. But thanks to its overall deeper black level, this isn't so dramatic with the first version 24G2. See, the brightest spots are still pretty dark compared to the other one. This isn't top-notch uniformity either, but I think you get the point. Now, in terms of color accuracy, both versions are pretty much on par. There are a few minor differences here and there, but it's fair to say both deliver about the same color accuracy and fidelity with proper calibration and profiling. In addition to low delta E's, both versions have such similar color gamut volumes that we can call it a draw as well. 5% less or more of Adobe RGB coverage really doesn't make any difference if you're not a professional photo editor. Now, if you don't have access to a colorimeter, here are my recommended settings. Of course, these are different depending on the panel version you got, so make sure to check your version first. I'll also leave both ICC profiles linked down below, which can be used in conjunction with these settings. Alternatively, you could also use the sRGB mode to clamp the color gamut and to get a potentially more accurate representation of sRGB content. And both versions actually have decent sRGB modes, at least in terms of accuracy. The first version is closer to the desired D65 white point, whereas the second version meets the recommended delta E targets, which the V1 barely misses. Overall, that's a draw again, and unfortunately both versions have the same flaw, which is disabled color and brightness control. Especially the latter is quite a big deal, as both are quite bright in their respective sRGB modes. Personally, I would just stick with the user mode and use the provided recommended settings in conjunction with the ICC profile instead. Anyway, on paper it looks like the first version is a great pick for some content creation like photo or video editing, and I'm certainly very happy with the contrast and color performance for that matter. However, my unit shows some pixel inversion artifacts that can be seen as faint horizontal lines wandering from the top to the bottom of the screen, mainly visible in darker parts of the image. And with faint, I'm meaning you really have to look closely. But with critical viewing for photo or video editing, looking closely is pretty much mandatory. Unfortunately, these artifacts aren't easy to capture on camera. As you can see on the right, this shows as flickering on camera, which isn't visible with bare eyes, at least not with static images, but more on that in a bit. On the left side is the second version, which doesn't show these artifacts and no flickering on camera. Now, to stress that again, that flickering is just what it looks like on camera. Those inversion artifacts look like faint horizontal lines with bare eyes. However, funnily enough, the first version does also produce visible flicker under some circumstances. The flicker does only occur when FreeSync is enabled in the OSD and frame rates fluctuate. It's most apparent when dipping below the 100 FPS mark and especially noticeable in game menus. But this isn't just a problem restricted to gaming. I first noticed that when editing photos in Adobe Camera Raw. Zooming in causes some FPS dips, leading to annoying flickering when FreeSync is enabled in the monitor's OSD. Using the ruler function is particularly bad, but the flicker is gone when turning off FreeSync. In-game, you can leave FreeSync turned on if you can ensure very stable frame rates, ideally above 100 FPS at all times. The second version 24G2 doesn't show any flickering issues at all, so that's certainly a welcome change. Now, as usual, I've used Blurbuster's pursuit camera technique to capture how both monitors handle moving objects, aka how good their response times are, if you will. Starting with the first version 24G2, we can see that the overdrive modes are actually doing something for the response time performance. Strong shows the lowest amount of ghosting, so we're obviously gonna choose that. As I mentioned in my initial review, all overdrive options of the newer version actually look the same. We're just gonna go with strong here as well, but it really doesn't matter. Comparing all ideal overdrive modes side by side, it's safe to say that we're getting a pretty good performance with both versions here throughout the refresh range. Though version 2 has the slight edge when it comes to 120Hz and even more so at 60. We're gonna take a closer look at the 144Hz performance in a few seconds, but it's noteworthy that the second version has a single ideal overdrive mode that can be used throughout the refresh range, whereas with version 1 we need to dial back the overdrive to medium at 60Hz to avoid inverse ghosting. Now, comparing the 144Hz performance side by side, the second version has the slight edge over the original 24G2. This is clearly not a night and day difference, but version 2 shows less ghosting or smearing at the trailing left edge of the UFO. If you're very sensitive to smearing, that's definitely something to keep in mind. If you're not particularly sensitive, the first version should be fast enough as well. Now let's throw some competitors into the mix. There's the ASUS VG2409Q, basically matching the performance of the second version 24G2, which doesn't come totally unexpected given they both use the same panel. Together, these two are the fastest 24-inch IPS that I've encountered so far. The first version 24G2 can't quite keep up here, just as the MSI G241, which shows even a little bit more ghosting than the first gen AOC. To be clear, this still is a pretty good performance that we're getting from either the first version AOC or from the MSI. The other two monitors are just top notch. When it comes to backlight strobing, both versions of the AOC provide their so-called motion blur reduction setting, reaching from 0, which is off, to 20. The second version shows slightly better results, but this is pretty much a meaningless victory to be honest. Even though the second version has better strobing than the first version, it still isn't worth recommending. So where does that leave us? Well, any conclusions about which version is the better monitor are a bit meaningless to be honest if we don't know which version we're actually getting until buying one, unboxing it and booting into the factory menu. Depending on the return policies in your country, it might already be too late then. But with the help of my subscribers, I could match the serial number to the panel that's being used. This serial number is printed onto the monitor as well as outside onto the box. If you're buying local, that's obviously a great and easy way to check which panel the monitor has before spending your cash. Well, buying local is not always possible these days, so for shopping online, we need retailers to start listing this information on their website. For now at least, ask your retailer for this information before making a purchase, or even request a specific unit. The numbers you need to know are on the side of the box where the barcodes can be found. Above the barcodes there are two serial numbers, one starting with H, the other starting with A. Numbers that start with HDN for the first number and ATN for the second one denote the first version, hence the original or old 24G2. The second version, aka the new one, has numbers starting with HDP and AWB respectively. That being sorted out, let's tackle the big question. Is the second version inferior? The short answer, no, it's not. Well, at least not at large. See, it depends on what you're planning to use your monitor for. If you plan to watch a lot of videos, especially movies and series on your monitor, then you obviously want that higher contrast ratio that the first version will provide. If that's not your top priority and you're more interested in gaming, then the second version may be the better choice. 1000:1 is still plenty enough contrast for gaming and you're getting slightly faster response times, so less smearing or ghosting. And the second version doesn't flicker when using adaptive sync, and that's certainly something I can appreciate. If you're on the other hand need that higher maximum brightness, you get 100 nits more from the first version. See, it's not that easy. I'm a bit torn which version I prefer for content creation. Both versions provide pretty good color performance, but the second version has the weaker contrast ratio, whereas the first one shows some pixel inversion artifacts, which I personally find pretty distracting when editing photos or videos. I guess you have to pick a poison there, or buy a completely different monitor altogether. If you just want a good, affordable 144Hz monitor and don't have any particular wishes, you can't go wrong with either one. I'm sure any version of the 24G2 will serve you great, especially considering that it's usually among the cheapest options in its class. Speaking of other options, there's the MSI G241, which is pretty comparable to the first version 24G2. It also provides close to a 1500:1 contrast ratio, and it's very similar in terms of overall picture quality. Though my G241 had no visible pixel inversion artifacts and also didn't flicker with adaptive sync, so that's definitely a plus. On the other hand, the MSI doesn't come with a fully adjustable stand and the minimum brightness setting is pretty bright. As far as I'm aware, these two are the only IPS monitors in their class that provide such a high contrast ratio, so I guess you'll have to live with either of the drawbacks if that's what you're after. For an even better contrast ratio, there's the G24C4, also by MSI. This suffers from similar FreeSync flicker as the first version 24G2, however, as a VA monitor it exceeds its contrast ratio, making this an even better choice if you're watching a lot of movies on your monitor. Though this wouldn't be my pick if your usage contains a lot of text reading, editing, or if fast-paced gaming is your top priority. The latter is where the ASUS VG2409Q shines. It's very similar to the second version 24G2 as it uses the same panel, though ASUS managed to squeeze a little bit more brightness out of that and therefore this would be my pick when prices are the same. But often the AOC 24G2 is the significantly cheaper monitor, making this a worthy pick over the ASUS. Now, after my initial review of the second version 24G2, I do think that there were some misunderstandings. The reason to criticize AOC is that they made significant changes to a product without telling anyone. But it's not like the second version is a trash product or that it's generally inferior to the original version. Some things got worse, others were improved. Depending on what you're planning to use your monitor for, either the first or the second version can be the better choice, as hopefully became clear throughout this video. So the point is, many buyers haven't had this choice and thought they were buying a different monitor. And that's the reason to call AOC out on. For the future, I hope that AOC and retailers are now taking actions so that anyone interested in buying a 24G2 will clearly know which version they're spending their cash on. Thanks for watching and consider to subscribe.